Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. We always start these off with the same question, which is, what were you like growing up, and what was your life like growing up?
So, I grew up in northern New Jersey. My dad was an engineer, so always had an interest in math and science, like figuring out, using geometry, how tall the sycamore was in our backyard. And went to a big public high school, and then came to New Haven. Not for the first time. The family connection goes back a ways. My great grandfather brought his young family here in 1908 or so. I meant to wear my grandfather's Hill House High School class pin from 1915. So my grandfather went to Yale as a townie. That was our foot in the door. That we've kept the door propped open for years since then. Just delighted to be back in New Haven. I was here as an undergrad and also at SOM, seeing just how nicely this city's developing, and particularly the entrepreneurial culture. Even just the last couple of years, really a step function in energy and excitement.
So you've been involved in startups and venture capital. Did you have exposure to entrepreneurship early on in your life?
Somewhere I have, and I can't remember what the motivation for this was, but I made a business card when I was 12 years old that says, then I was Bob Bettigole, entrepreneur. So, and I think that my grandfather was an attorney, but on his own. My dad was a civil engineer, bridge engineer, and I guess I was probably about that age, around 12, when he went out on his own, started his own consulting practice in a little office in New York City, with a big crack in the wall. He had an enlargement made of a bridge that he'd worked on to cover the crack in case not that any clients were going to come to this office. Entrepreneurship in the family, but it really wasn't until after. Well, I shouldn't say that. So after Yale as an undergrad, I worked as an engineer for the Navy doing signal processing stuff. But I started a consulting business on the computer consulting business, as it was called, writing code for a couple clients.
You eventually came back to Yale for business school. What precipitated that? And I just want to make sure that everybody can hear. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Microphone higher.
Just in case.
Just in case. Okay, fine. And I can also speak really loudly, but not as loudly as the people watching remotely would need, I suppose. So I worked as an engineer for 5 years. First, as I said, working for the Navy in New London at the campus, the Fort Trumbull campus that became the Pfizer headquarters, and then spent a year designing talking gadgets for the visually impaired in New York City, where my then future wife was living. Worked for the American Foundation for the Blind. And just wanted to kind of broaden out and do something bigger. I had no idea what it was. And of the few places I looked into, SOM seemed the best match. It seemed that people came from a really wide range of backgrounds, nonprofit, government, for-profit companies in different fields. And none of them really had any idea what they wanted to do, so it seemed like I would fit in well. So it was the only place I applied and fortunately got in.
In that process, did you figure out what you wanted to do, or did that happen later, or are you still figuring it out?
I am still figuring out. It's really been a bit of a random walk. So I had a summer internship in the venture capital business. So this was summer of 1982. Just to give you an idea on scale, the entire venture industry then was about $2 billion. And last year, venture capitalists invested about $100 billion just in last year in companies. So it was a much smaller business. There weren't a lot of internships around, but I was fortunate to get one. And then following during my second year, when I was interviewing for positions, trying to find a full-time venture capital job, I met with a guy named Frank Driscoll at Rothschild Inc. in New York. And Frank, who unfortunately passed away many years ago, had been lead investor or co-lead investor in Federal Express and Cray Research, which was the first supercomputer company, and a bunch of semiconductor and computer companies. And we spoke for a while, and he said, well, you'll probably do venture for a while, and then you'll be an entrepreneur for a while, and then maybe you'll come back to venture. And I walked out of this meeting thinking, what was that? I mean, I've just met him this one time, but in fact, that's been my career. So I worked. I got a job with Rothschild. I was there for a few years. Was a partner in the funds, although very small partner. Left to join one of my partners managing the U.S. investment operations for the Wallenberg Group, big Swedish industrial group, Investor AB, and I did the technology investing, both public and private. And then in '91, I kind of got the bug to be doing something a little more hands-on, and left what I refer to as my last real job, and did a few different things. So I worked with a couple different teams, and it's just funny. At the time, it's a small little startup. So many people here are entrepreneurs at the early stages of their companies, and hopefully, when you look back 15, 20 years later. It'll be from the perspective of just how big it's become. So, one that didn't get to be a big company but became a big idea was a cousin of mine, Stuart Haber, is a mathematician and cryptographer, and he and his partner at Bellcore, which was kind of the part of Bell Labs that went with the operating companies when AT&T was split up, had developed a cryptographically secure way of showing that, proving that any digital document had not been changed after a certain point in time. And we started a company called we called it Digital Timestamping at first, and then it became Surety Technologies. Always an application in technology in search of a strong use case. But if you look at Satoshi's paper on Bitcoin, there are 8 papers cited at the end, and 3 of them are by Stuart and his partner, because they invented blockchain. We couldn't figure out what to do with it, and I have to say I'm still in that category of I still need to be shown that there's a compelling use case. The other company was a little startup, a couple of scientists from Yale. They were starting a company called BioCore. Really strong entrepreneur as the founder. Wrote the first kind of business plan, wasn't a full business plan for them, introduced them to some VCs, life science VCs. That company became Alexion. Unfortunately, I didn't have any shares, but where I'd have newer genes on. You just never know. And so after that's when I got involved with the infrastructure business that you mentioned early on.
So, what did you take away from those 2 experiences at Surety, searching for an application for a technology, and then at Alexion, seeing something really early on that probably the path wasn't clear yet? What do you think it takes to find a path, and how do you kind of apply that today?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both excellent cases. I'd probably see the same things in them if they were new now. In the case of Surety, it was you have to know what you're going to do with the technology, right? It's got to be, I always rank things people first by far, and then an attractive market opportunity, and then some sort of protected way, some kind of way of defending your foothold in an industry, patented technology or secret algorithm or whatever. So they just didn't have the market. At the time, the only use case that we had was for patents. So at the time, the U.S. system differed from the rest of the world except Japan in that we were on a first to invent basis. So it didn't matter if somebody else got to the patent office first. If you could prove that you'd come up with the idea earlier, then you'd win. So people were moving to digital lab notebooks then. And so this was a way, by weaving in a cryptographic hash of your digital record with those of many other people in the world, then you get a digital certificate. You could prove that you hadn't changed it after that date. In fact, they still publish in the personals or the classified ads in the New York Times every Sunday. So 25 years later, a key so that people can continue to validate their documents, and there's still some users of the system. With Alexion, I was so impressed with Lenny Bell. When Lenny was a young teenager, the family would spend summers on Martha's Vineyard, and Lenny started a sailing school. He was too young to teach sailing, so he hired college kids But so just besides being a brilliant scientist, just a natural entrepreneur. And people like Lenny are really rare. And when I meet them, I try to strike up some sort of business relationship. Yeah.
Do all the successful companies that you see have that person? Because I think we hear about that from time to time, but I'm not sure if it applies to every company.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in a business idea without somebody who's going to be passionate and bring life to it. So with the spin-outs from Yale that we do, 12 of our companies have been, 13 of our companies have been Yale spin-outs. One was with an undergrad math software company called Desmos. But the other 12 were scientists or clinicians here that were going to keep their day jobs in most cases. So we look for a PhD student or a postdoc that's going to bring kind of that passion, because starting companies is super hard. Even with the best ideas and money, it's still there. I don't know of any that haven't gone through difficult periods, even the most successful ones. We're talking about Alexion. I remember crunching up the stairwell at 25 Science Park through the broken glass and rat droppings. And they had a couple of near-death experiences, when they were running out of money. Mm-hmm. So you need to be the persistence and the belief in what you're doing to see it through.
Do you think people can know when that's blind faith or they're on the right path? And are there any indicators?
Yeah, right. I mean, is Will Rogers, right? Is that the light at the end of the tunnel, or is it the headlight of the oncoming train? It's another thing we look for in people is, are they self-aware? Mm-hmm. And I think sort of my favorite model. It doesn't always work out this way, but often you people like this, really smart, motivated people that have identified an interesting market opportunity and a way to address it, and that's enough to get funding. And then when you have really smart people with capital, provided that they have some flexibility of how they think about things, there's often a pivot, smaller or larger. In the case of Alexion, the original long-term goal was to develop farms where you'd have pigs growing human organs, or human-compatible organs. What was consistent through that was their understanding of a part of the immune system, the complement system, and that remains a strong basis of what they do. It's the underpinning of this is the way their drug Soliris works. But they pivot, and I'll give you an example from one of our companies. So we started a company called P2 Science, a spin-out from Yale. Paul Anastas is the faculty member, one of the co-founders of the field of green chemistry, and his PhD student Patrick Foley had come up with a novel class of surfactants. Surfactants are the active ingredient in soaps and detergents, I guess the simplest way of saying it. So I found somebody who was an expert in surfactants, 20 years of industry experience, first engaged him as a consultant. But then we started a company with Patrick. Within weeks of his finishing his PhD, we'd provided initial funding to the company. And then along the way, Patrick was trying to figure out how to make these surfactants from natural feedstocks, sustainable feedstocks. So many surfactants come from petrochemicals. So this surfactants have two parts. They have an oily part and a carbohydrate or sugary part. And lots of ways to get to the carbohydrate part, but the particular kind of fatty piece that was part of this molecule, he wondered why people hadn't used ozonolysis to access it from vegetable oils like canola and palm and soy and corn. And as he did more research, he found that there were issues with ozonolysis. So ozone, everybody knows, was a more reactive form of oxygen, but it cuts double bonds in organic molecules very precisely. But it also, in the 50s, there were some big explosions. It can be unsafe to work with. And he figured out a safe way of doing it. We have an engineering partner, $500 million a year engineering company that we work with. So now we have a way of making this kind of fancier surfactant that would sell for maybe $6 a kilogram. But we could also make fragrance molecules that might sell for $600 a kilogram. $60 more or less, most of them, but some are $600 or $6,000. So the company pivoted to being based, at least initially, on this process chemistry, making fragrance molecules, and that's where all our customers are. Chanel and some of the ingredient suppliers like Givaudan and International Flavors and Fragrance. We'll get back to making the surfactants later in larger plants that somebody else will finance. But right now we're building a plant in Naugatuck to produce these very high value specialty chemicals. And because he had this open mind and was able to take the business in the right direction, and he had the capital and he had the management support to do it.
So when somebody comes to you, if they do, and say, we're going to pivot, when you make those pivots, do they typically seem obvious, or is it a tough decision to make?
It varies. Again, it's like the oncoming train, right? Are we really close? Do we just need to change how we sell? Do we need to hire more salespeople, or do we need to go after a different market segment? So I think it really varies with the situation. The common thread is keeping an open mind. I think from the entrepreneur's point of view, it's building consensus with investors, and one of the things that many of you here have raised money or are raising money. I remember a first-time entrepreneur telling me that she just couldn't wait till she finished the financing so she could get back to managing the business. CEO and founder, and that's just not the way it works. I mean, you're always raising money, but you're also always working with your investors, because you will be raising money again, or you're going to be pivoting, and you'll need support. So those relationships are critical, and you always have to be working on them.
So going back a little bit, you're at Alexion. You ended up running an infrastructure business. How did that transition happen, and could you tell us a little bit about the company?
Yeah, so I mean, to be clear, I was never at Alexion, just kind of working with Lenny Bell and Steve Squinto in the early days, getting it started. The infrastructure business is back to my dad in the backyard showing me how to figure out how tall our sycamore was. It was, by the way, it was 65 feet tall. I do remember that. It was kind of a really big moment that you could use similar triangles, and you could do this thing with some straws and some string and some pieces of paper and figure out how tall this tree was. So I had left my last real job. My father had built his engineering practice into about 100 employees. Most of their work was in the New York, New Jersey area. His main office was in New Jersey, and he sold the business to a subsidiary of Thermo Electron, and was just kind of playing around with an idea he had that he'd filed patents on, which was a new way of building a bridge deck. So the bridge decks, most of them are concrete. You drive over them. That's the roadway surface, but they take the biggest beating on the bridge generally and wear out most quickly. When the bridges were built, whenever that was, 50, 100 years ago, no traffic was going over there, so it wasn't a problem how long it took to put the deck in place. But when traffic volumes got to modern levels, then taking a lane or two lanes out of service for an extended period of time is a problem. At the same time, the trucking industry was pushing Congress for higher and higher load limits on the trucks that could travel on the highways, and the heavier loads again took their toll on the structures. So my dad had come up with an idea for a way of making panels and replacing the deck at night. So I just got started. I said, well, you're not doing any kind of marketing or PR. Let me write you a business plan, and you have this one project near the Bear Mountain Bridge up by the Hudson, just north of there. And I have a friend who's a professional cameraman. So we'll make a promotional video. And I just got sucked in by the story. So, kind of fast forward, I came up with a less expensive way of building the same general concept that my dad had come up with, and negotiated and renegotiated our license agreements with 3 manufacturers. So most of what I was doing was technical marketing. So working with state bridge engineers, with consulting engineering firms, But we could do a show of hands. Has anybody driven across the Tappan Zee Bridge since 1997? Yeah, okay, I thought so. So you've driven on the bridge deck that I hold patents on with my father. The old bridge, not the new bridge. But that was one of the projects that helped put my kids through college. So thank you all for beating up the bridges as you drive around. Make sure if I were still in the business, I would say please use studded snow tires because they really rip up the pavement. And I got to work on some really interesting bridges besides the Tappan Zee. Again, kind of my engineering science background. I don't know if people have been to St. Louis, and you may know the Saarinen Arch, the big arch, which was commissioned to be a gateway to the West as a landmark for the city. But the reason he chose the arch was because of the Eads Bridge, which is 3 arch spans over the Mississippi, opened to traffic in 1874. And it's just a remarkable story of this self-taught engineer who pioneered that bridge. First use of cast steel in a bridge in the U.S. and it was contemporaneous with the Brooklyn Bridge, so they were kind of in a rush. And Eads finished first, but we all think of the Brooklyn Bridge instead. So.
Was that a venture-backed business?
No, that was a bootstrap business.
So how does that sort of compare to when you're sitting on the side of the table as a VC, and what do you think that's a business that you could have taken to VC, and when would you recommend somebody goes the bootstrap route versus raising money?
Okay, well, the more interesting question is that one about bootstrap versus VC, which we can talk about, but just to address the infrastructure question. Yeah, we were always short on cash, and so I had some consultants and some people I worked with, but it was really me and my dad a little bit. And it could have been a bigger business. We could have brought on some other products, but selling to the government is tough. The federal code says you have to bid any proprietary item against equally satisfactory non-proprietary items. A project bids with something spec'd in it, and then the contractor is going to try to find more money, so he's going to look for something cheaper, even though your product may have been designed in. So it's a really tough business. So I'm a little bit allergic to investing in companies that sell to the government. We're happy investors in SeeClickFix, I should say, but it's kind of the exception. But as far as bootstrap versus investors, and there's so many different choices about where you go for capital. I think the first thing is people just have to be honest with themselves about personal goals. Are you trying to build a successful business? Are you building a way of life for yourselves and your employees? These are all equally valid. Because once you take once you have partners, then there are whether they're business partners or investor partners, then there are other people involved, and most likely will have different long-term goals. So VCs invest out of 10-year funds with a 10-year life, but the reality of it is that for many funds is we're a bit of an exception because we're 12 years in and just raising our new fund now, but most of the time it's on the order of 5 years, and then you raise a new fund. Well, if you want to get new investors in, it's nice to show some exits. So there's some motivation to sell some of the businesses in order to encourage new investors to see your results and then invest in your new fund. But ultimately, we have to get liquidity for our investors. So there's going to have to be some sort of transaction. Company goes public or is acquired, or another investor, much less common, another investor comes in and takes out the earlier investors. But it's also a question of how big do you want it to be. So if you look at some famous bootstrap models like Under Armour or Burt's Bees, those founders sold their products out of the back of their station wagons for years and years before, and it just takes so long in consumer products. Web has enabled some other things, but it takes a long time to build a business bootstrapping. And then you have to look at how much time do you have, what are competitors doing, And just evaluate. If you're looking at it from a financial point of view, you do the calculation about, okay, if I raise $5 million, I can hire these people, I can do this in product development, I can get to this point, I'll own a smaller piece of it, it'll be a bigger pie, or I can bootstrap. It's going to be a smaller company, it's going to take longer, but I'll own a larger chunk of it, and just have to weigh all those different factors.
Was it hard working with family?
It is really hard working with family. My dad died almost 10 years ago, and I miss him. I learned a ton of stuff from him. But it was also hard working with him. So we worked in the same office for a number of years, and then we worked in different offices. So, he was at a point in his life where he'd been successful financially in selling his business. He and my mom were comfortable, and so there wasn't any aspect of that. He was always kind of an overly proud dad, so he was happy to see me doing well. But I wanted to move things quickly, and yet he was the one with the technical expertise. I gave a talk at some engineering conference about our bridge deck design. And I thought, okay, it's an engineering group, but I'll throw in a little bit of humor. I'll say that I was genetically a bridge engineer. And the guy introducing me said that Rob is a genetics engineer. So much for that approach. But we'd be in these situations with meeting with engineers, and it was their job to design the bridge. And they're not going to get in trouble by doing it the old-fashioned way, saying, well, we're not going to be able to achieve this load rating because the bridge weighs too much. Why take a chance on this new design with these lightweight panels? They're not going to get in trouble for that. So we're asking people to take a bit of a risk. And my dad first of all, he was a very intuitive engineer, and he would want to understand everything about the project. And he had a hard time. He never really told people they were stupid, but he would point out that there, in not a very delicate way, that there were better ways of doing the overall design, not our part of it. And he was right. And I'd say, Dad, afterwards, I say, Dad, we're not selling to the bridge. We're selling to these individuals. But here's a tip that I learned in this business, and it may apply in some other situations, which was. Two engineers or maybe three engineers that were very successful with some of our biggest projects were doing their last design job before they retired. So they weren't worried about, okay, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to be out of a job, because they were leaving anyway. So if you're trying to break into a new market, you need to look for advocates that are going to be motivated for whatever reasons to listen and take a chance with you.
It's really interesting. So eventually you helped found Elm Street Ventures. How did that transition happen? Where did it come from?
So I was happy running my little bridge deck business, although it had been over 10 years, and I was thinking it was time for something new. And I had spoken to people. I have friends in a number of places at Yale, and I know the guys at the Yale Investment Office. So we'd talked before about how Yale might better commercialize their technology, and I'd spoken with the provost and dean of the graduate school and dean of the medical school a few times over the years earlier in the 90s, and then it was actually in 2003 I was approached by a company interested in buying my business, the bridge deck business. They needed a new product line. They saw the potential in what we were doing, but they needed something new to say when they called on engineers, because they were selling bearings and bridge joints, kind of commodity products. Good company, they've been around for 100 years, but they needed a new story. And then the next day I got a call from friends at Yale, and they said, we want to take another shot at putting a fund together, and they asked if I would run it. So Yale made a commitment of $10 million, and my task was to build a team and to raise at least that much. So we closed on, with some extensions over the years, we ended up being a $25 million fund.
So it seems like you've invested pretty heavily in the life science area. Was that by design, or is that a product of where you are in your relationships?
Yeah, so It's by design. We started out. Now there's no strings on the money. We can invest in anything. We've done some software investments. We've invested in a company in California and one in New York, outside of Yale connections. But our primary focus is here, and we also work with Jackson Labs in Yukon, I should say. But more of our investments have been in New Haven, and 80% of the research dollars that come into Yale are for the life sciences. And of that 80%, 10% funds clinical trials. So 70% is what goes towards research. And it's just kind of logical that if that's where the investment is being made on developing the technology, that's where the opportunities will be. So the team I put together, everybody but me from the initial team had either an MD or a PhD. And that's still largely true, although Chris McLeod, who's joined me as a full-time managing partner, like me, was an engineer undergrad and has an MBA.
So it seems like the model you use co-founding companies is pretty unique for a VC. How did that come to be, and does it change how you have to interact with potential founders? Does it change the investments you make at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've not. We've only done that where we're starting a company from scratch and we're working with a faculty member. I guess in one case we had an idea for a business and teamed up with another research institution outside of Yale, but we put it together around the business. So we weren't saying to an existing team of entrepreneurs, we'll come in, we'll invest, but we're going to run it. That's not what we're about at all. We are really happy to invest in great teams with a great idea, and attractive market and all the rest. But what Yale saw in backing us was that this area, Yale plus this region, there's a really vast. If you compare it to Boston, New York, San Francisco, the infrastructure is not here yet. The critical mass may not be here yet, but the ideas are here and the people are here. So the whole idea behind Elm Street Ventures is to be a catalyst.
Excuse me, what do you mean by infrastructure? What components?
Established venture funds, networks of successful entrepreneurs, investors, and I'd have to say we're among them. Look to minimize risk with their investments, and that tends to lead people to invest in people that have done it before. So, and there just weren't a lot of people here that had been CEOs of startup companies. So, a couple of my initial partners had been CEOs of a number of Yale spinouts. And Mike Sherman, I think, did 7 different spinouts, and 4 of them were Yale startups. So we could bring that. I'm not going to be CEO of all the companies. We'd be happy if we never did that again. Although we really enjoy it. I mean, it's fun being an entrepreneur, right? It's got its ups and downs, but I'm going to give you an example of our most recent company, Osmel Therapeutics. Barbara Ehrlich is a professor of pharmacology at Yale, and we started a company with her. My partner, Brian Dixon, who was at Bayer till they closed their doors. Spent 14 years there as a VP of drug discovery and development. So Brian is the CEO. We funded it with another investor, and we'll be in front of the FDA we'll hear back from the FDA from the pre-IND meeting in May, and then hope to be treating patients the end of this year. Now, this is a treatment to try to prevent peripheral neuropathy in chemotherapy patients. So I'm sure most people in this room know people, friends or relations who've been through chemo, and there are two major nasty side effects. One is called peripheral neuropathy, so pain and numbness in hands and feet. And with the taxanes in particular, there's a very high incidence, 30, 40, 50% of patients, even the first time through chemo, have these debilitating side effects. close to 100% of people if they go through a second course of chemo. And there's no cure, and there's been no way of preventing it. So Barbara Ehrlich's work, with her work, she can prevent it in mice. So the challenge is to prevent it now in people. We're repurposing an old drug. We've issued patent and developing the formulations, and we'll be treating patients quite soon.
So what's the biggest mistake you've made as an investor, the toughest lesson you've had
Wow, how
to
much
learn?
time do we have?
Well, that's why I tried to limit it to just one.
Yeah, I guess one thing I have to remind myself all the time is to think of it as like, not leading the witness. So when I'm meeting with somebody and they're telling me about their business, I'm already re-engineering it and giving them my ideas for what the business could become, and seeing where it could go and all these things. And sometimes the ideas are, most of the time the ideas are stupid. I just don't know enough about the business. But few entrepreneurs will say that because they're there to raise capital. But it also keeps me from hearing, what's their vision, where are they going to do? Because ultimately, if I'm going to back them, I have to develop faith that they're going to have the right ideas and head in the right direction. So there've been a few times when I've made investments, looking through my eyes, not their eyes.
So you've sat on the board of a number of companies. You're sitting on the board of a number of companies. What's your role in that position, and how do you think you can be most helpful, and what do you see, or what should investors look for in board members?
Yeah, well, there are a few different things there. First of all, try to keep the boards small and functional. It's hard now when you raise capital. The venture capital business is very competitive now, and so people want to take credit for the investments they've made. So everybody wants either a board seat or an observer seat or both. And so you end up with meetings that are 12 or 15 people, and it's really hard to get anything done with that kind of group in a short period of time. When you're putting a board together, you want to look for people that, and if you're lucky enough to have a choice of investors, look for people that are really going to add value. So for us, we have pretty good network here in Connecticut, so we're able to make connections with other people, help build the team. Just by way of example, we're investors in another Yale startup called Artisan Biosciences, which is a microbiome company. And because of connections, we were able to help them find their head of biology. And then, but the board work is helping the CEO with a kind of long-term vision, but also kind of the shorter, the strategic and tactical issues. Typically the investors will sit on the compensation committee, and if you can't avoid it as an investor, you end up on the audit committee. But somebody's got to do it. It's an important role as well. And when we're working with younger entrepreneurs, trying to be a bit of a mentor, or help them find mentors. We always want to see at least one independent board member on the board, even when we're investing in seed stage companies. So one of the things that we do in addition to our own fund is we manage what's been called the Yei Innovation Fund, or Yale Entrepreneurial Institute Innovation Fund, which provides $100,000 investments in student-led startups. It's in transition now because Yale has redone their entrepreneurship program with Tsai CITY, the Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, and so the Yei name may change. But the fund remains about a $4 million fund. And standard advice to young entrepreneurs, they're just getting $100,000 from us. They're not, we don't take control, but we advise people to put a board together. It's a discipline that's important early on. You set a budget at the beginning of the year, and your board's going to hold you to it, or be open to listening if you need to make a pivot.
So going back, you've talked about people as one of the first things you look for. Can you break that down? What does the wrong person look like? Is it just motivation or buy-in? Are there certain traits you look for?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if we're talking about leaders, look for people who are not afraid to work with people smarter than they are. Looking for in kind of the interview process, finding people that strike that right balance between fair and appropriate modesty when other people have done things, but also making it clear what they've done. So one of my early partners, I remember we were interviewing as potential associates actually, and this person who I really liked a lot, my first meeting with him, he would say things like, I worked on this project, or I helped with this, and Phil said, well, no, what did you do? So, you don't want, personally, I don't want to work with people that are, too full of themselves, but I really, people have to have enough self-confidence to make things happen. I guess it's kind of finding that a person who's at that right point of competence and confidence, so that they're really ready to lead an organization.
Any questions?
And they're hungry. Maybe talk about attitude. That's what I always find is crucial.
Yeah, and this gets at the team issue as well. Is at a startup, you'll spend more time with your partners, waking time with your partners, than you do with your spouse or domestic partner, and half of marriages end in divorce, right? So paying attention to those relationships, and startups, there's never any time to do that, but you have to make sure that you make your partners in the business successful. You have to understand their personal goals and work to help them be successful if the business is going to be successful, because it's a relationship. And if I had to pick the one thing that causes businesses to fail, it's when early on is when the founding team falls apart.
I had a question back at the orchid level. So, can you extract like the fragrance from like a cat litter or something? I mean, sometimes it's much more subtle because it can be a major.
So yeah, the whole fragrance world is a really interesting one. So our team are synthetic chemists. So they may be making a molecule that's the same as what's found in nature, or it may be something that smells the same as in nature. It's really a fascinating field. I am by far no expert. I am not an organic chemist, which makes it very hard sometimes when we at the technical sessions. But Chanel No. 5, for example, has 50 different ingredients in it, 50 different fragrances, and you've heard of the quote, the noses that are the experts that put perfumes and fragrances together. But there's scents that are used in almost every product, and they're almost all a fragrance package that the manufacturer buys from one of the big fragrance companies. I think it's an $18 billion industry and they're 5 big companies, but a number of smaller ones, including one here in Connecticut called Bettigole, and that's in Danbury.
Thank you.
We're talking about infrastructure from the last few years and looking forward. What things have gotten you excited about the infrastructure around New Haven for entrepreneurship?
Well, yeah, when you said infrastructure, I started thinking about roads and bridges, because that's where my head goes right away. And one comment on that before we talk about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the new entrepreneurial center at Yale, Tsai CITY, had their pitch day in the end of the first semester, and I was a judge. And they were just fantastic pitches, nonprofits, for-profit companies. And one was just was an idea of people thinking about the future of transportation, and kind of to paraphrase them is what does intermodal transportation mean in the age of autonomous vehicles, right? I mean, it's here's a bus that leaves New York headed who knows where, and demand can fill it along the way, as it meets up in a parking lot somewhere with an Uber or with an autonomous vehicle. And that may have implications for New Haven as well if we're unsuccessful in convincing people that live along the coast to let us go from two rail lines to 4. High-speed rail in this corridor between Boston and New York would make an enormous difference to business. It would make it accessible. It would be a much larger labor pool. So we found that for the most exciting companies, that it's possible to recruit really good people from around the country. But it adds a layer of complexity. People say, okay, I can move here. Somebody who's in their 40s and they've got a young family. I can move there for this job, but if the job doesn't work or the company gets sold, I'm going to have to move my family again. So that's been an issue. If it were 40 minutes to New York or Boston, then that goes away. They can move here knowing that if they had to, they could commute for a while to find something else. I know Senator Murphy is spending a lot of time on that project, and I hope it gets some legs. I think the most encouraging thing is meetings like this, co-working spaces like the Grove, some of the funding that the state's made available through various programs, whether it's Connecticut Next or the increased funding at Connecticut Innovations, or some of the grants that DECD has made. It's kind of a rising tide lifting all boats, and what we see specifically at Yale is that all the interest among undergraduates in entrepreneurship is kind of catching fire with the faculty. Maybe starting with some of the younger faculty, but it's really remarkable how much has changed in the last 2-3 years. Yale was given a grant of $10 million by the Blavatnik family, so they have the Blavatnik Fund, and it's $100,000 or $300,000 grants to take things out of the lab. All the money has to be spent outside of the lab. It has to be spent commercially, whether it's manufacturing for a product or animal testing. There were 70 applicants for this year's group, up from maybe 50 last year. Almost all better thought through, farther along. So I think everything that people are doing as entrepreneurs encourages others, and we'll get there.
All right, another question. I have a bunch of friends. I'm from Fairfield, Westport, and my one friend who I rode with, he sold Jet.com. He had a small piece in that. And obviously, that's a whale of an investment, and obviously, for only 2 years, so that's really rare for a company to be able to, revolutionize itself. But there are a lot of investors in Westport who are buying gas companies and other types of companies, and I see that happening with all these guys who talk about it. So I think there's a lot happening there. But maybe that needs to get connected to you guys, or just to know that the availability of that.
Well, there's a lot of capital in Fairfield. I think Fairfield County. I think a lot of people like living in Connecticut, want to stay in Connecticut, would like to invest in Connecticut, and I think that's part of the culture we need to develop here. I was talking to Andrew McLaughlin last week, who's the head of Tsai CITY, which I keep talking about at Yale. Very successful entrepreneur on the tech side, and he says one of the things that differentiates Silicon Valley from much of the rest of the world is this culture of reinvestment. So somebody has a successful exit, and then they invest in half a dozen new startups, and we need to build that culture here in Connecticut. You say you're a rower?
Yeah.
Good. We can talk afterwards, because the city's building a new boathouse right here in the harbor. And sorry?
I saw your socks.
Well, they're not actually. They look like shells, but they're actually fishing lures.
Oh.
I have one rowing buddy who has red and green socks, port and starboard. But if you see any rowing socks, let me know. Yeah.
What's a recent investment you made that you're excited about, and why are you excited about
Well, I talked about Osmel Therapeutics. So we've been fundraising for a while now for our new fund. So it's been over a year since we made a new investment. We've continued to meet with folks. So we hopefully are just a few months away from closing our new fund and being able to invest again. You know, I get excited by almost all the things I see first time around. I should probably warn people that, you know, if we talk about your idea, say this is great, and then, you know, but we only invest in, you know, when we have capital to invest, we only invest in 2-3 things a year. So, and it's, you know, it's a question of, you know, the right thing at the right time. On the life sciences side, really excited about you know, my partner Chris calls precision medicine, a fairly commonly used term now. Haven't found the right place to play there. You know, everybody talks about AI and machine learning. I think there's a lot more to be done with the data that's being collected that'll improve our lives, and rather than just being kind of nice to know. You know, if you wear a Fitbit and it counts steps, okay, but is it really actionable information? And many of the things we see, kind of in diagnostics and so on, fall into that category of kind of nice to know, but it's not going to have a big impact on people's lives. So, and we look for things where there's real impact, whether it's in life sciences or elsewhere. We have an investment in a company making new substrate for LEDs. It'll be higher power, more efficient LEDs. If they're successful, it's going to have a big impact on the world in terms of energy use and the quality of the headlights and big screens and so on that we all use.
What's your opinion on investing in B Corps? I know people these days don't usually do it. What do you guys think about it?
Yeah, I have a couple friends that have started B Corps. You know, it's kind of back to what I was saying before. Is you have to evaluate what your own goals are. I think it's always challenging to optimize two things at the same time. You know, and I think you can do a lot of what I think you can do informally what is done in a formal way with a B Corp. You know, I'm sort of not opposed to them, but as a financial investor, now obviously on a personal basis, I care about New Haven, I care about Yale, I care about, you know, products and services that are good for people. But I have investors that I need to provide a return to at some point. So it has to be really clear what the goals are, and they can still overlap well.
All the way in the back.
So you just mentioned something about meaningful impact, and just was curious, do you have some set metrics that you're using when you're evaluating your investments? Obviously ROI, but then other things that maybe perhaps you're looking at that are kind of established.
No formal metrics of, like, you know, social impact or you know, some things are common sense and hopefully becoming more common. That a diverse workforce is better than a kind of monoculture. I mean, we're in New Haven, the Elm City. Where are the elms, right? Because it was a monoculture and they were vulnerable. So we should keep that in mind as a lesson. You know, we think companies work better if they pay attention to the needs of their employees. You know, so all these things and kind of the ESG metrics that companies are increasingly using are important concepts to talk about. You know, when you talk about mission, when you talk about you know, employee benefits, and you talk about you know, the kind of company that you aspire for it to be.
But I have a friend who's an investor. He's invested in 4 or 5 companies. It's like burning cash. You must look at that potential company. Really look at that business model. Is there something innovative here? Is this going to make a difference in the marketplace? You must really, don't you go through a whole exercise before you make that decision to invest?
Oh, I mean, there's a ton of, we do a huge amount of due diligence before we invest. And it's, I'm fortunate to have a number of partners that are experts in their field. Nonetheless, we reach out to, we're trying to back, the best people in the field, so we have to find the number two as a consultant on the technical side. If there are patents involved, or potential patents involved, we'll get IP attorneys involved, and then if it's something that lends itself to speaking to customers, then we'll do that. So before we invested in SeeClickFix, we talked to a bunch of town and city managers about their experience with the product. You really have to understand why people buy. What do they see as the merits of it? What are the shortcomings? We do reference checks on individuals. So, there's a ton of work that goes into making a decision. The question was really more about, I thought, at least I interpreted it that way, is what's the social impact, and do we have specific metrics that we measure for the impact of the company?
How would you characterize the relationship between the Yale Entrepreneurial Team and the New Haven Entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. It's there's some overlap. There could be more. If we look at the state first and come back and talk about New Haven a little bit more, as I mentioned, we work closely with Connecticut Innovations. We're co-investors in half of our companies. They're great partners. They have programs that range for matching SBIR grants to the pre-seed financing, which is a great way for companies to get started, where they'll provide for companies that they approve up to $150,000 matching on a 2-for-1 basis for private capital. So you round up a bunch of friends and family at $75,000, and the state, if again they have to they have a process, but they'll put in 150. And there are a number of other state programs like CT Next and so on. As far as New Haven, we're eager to see companies stay here. I mean, the healthier the ecosystem is, the more companies are likely to start here. We've had a number that have stayed in New Haven. Others have moved out to Branford, in West Haven, and Woodbridge.
Thank you.